To understand the Varangian Guard, you must first understand the city they were summoned to protect. Imagine arriving by sea in the 10th century, after months on cold rivers and open water, and seeing it rise from the morning mist for the first time. The Norse called it Miklagard, the great city, and the word was not poetry. It was the largest, richest, most sophisticated metropolis in the Christian world. Where the markets of the north were a few wooden stalls beside a muddy harbor, here were streets lined with marble, a hippodrome that could hold tens of thousands of roaring spectators, and a cathedral whose golden dome seemed to float on light, so vast that a man standing beneath it felt he had walked into heaven itself. Constantinople was not merely a capital. It was the beating heart of the Roman Empire that had never truly fallen, the empire we now call Byzantine, though its people simply called themselves Romans and meant it. They traced their state in an unbroken line back to Augustus, and they guarded that inheritance with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. Behind triple walls that had turned back army after army for centuries, the emperors ruled over a world of staggering wealth and equally staggering danger. For all its splendor, this was a court soaked in suspicion. An emperor in Constantinople was the most powerful man on earth, and also one of the most vulnerable. He was surrounded by ambitious generals who commanded loyal armies, by relatives who eyed his throne with hungry patience, by eunuchs and ministers who spun webs of intrigue in every shadowed corridor. The history of Byzantium is a long catalogue of usurpations, blindings, poisonings, and palace coups carried out by the very men sworn to serve. To be emperor was to sit on a golden chair with a knife forever pressed against your back. And so a terrible problem haunted every ruler who wore the purple. Whom could he trust to guard his own body when the most dangerous men in the empire were the ones closest to him? Native guards had divided loyalties. They had families in the city, factions to please, futures to gamble on. A bodyguard drawn from the people of Constantinople might be loyal today and bought tomorrow. The emperor needed something else entirely. He needed warriors who owed nothing to anyone in the city, who could not be tempted by promises of land or marriage or power, who would have no reason to join a plot because they had no stake in who sat the throne, only in being paid by whoever did. He needed strangers, fierce, faithful, foreign strangers from the far edge of the known world. And in the late 10th century, a desperate emperor would find exactly that, in the most unlikely place imaginable, Prompton. A breathtaking panoramic view of 10th century Constantinople from the sea at dawn, its massive triple walls, golden cathedral dome, and sprawling marble city glowing in the mist, ships in the harbor below, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index 2, text ease. The fear was not abstract. By the year 987, the empire was tearing itself apart. On the throne sat a young man named Basil, the second emperor of that name, who would one day be remembered as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, the most formidable ruler Byzantium produced in centuries. But in those early years, he was anything but secure. He was a thin, unsmiling youth who had inherited a throne hedged about by powerful military aristocrats who regarded him as a boy to be controlled. When he tried to rule in his own right, the great families of Anatolia rose against him. The most dangerous of them was Bardas Phocas, a general of immense reputation and towering physical presence, a man from a dynasty that had produced emperors and believed it deserved to produce another. In the summer of 987, Phocas had himself proclaimed emperor by his rebel troops. He gathered an enormous army, the seasoned soldiers of the eastern provinces, and marched on the capital. By 988, his forces controlled much of Asia Minor and stood across the narrow water from Constantinople itself, close enough that Basil could almost see the campfires of the men who meant to drag him from his throne. The young emperor's situation was very nearly hopeless. He could not trust his own commanders, many of whom sympathized with the rebels, or simply waited to see which way the wind would blow. The armies he could count on were too few. The treasury, vast as it was, could not buy loyalty from men who smelled a change of regime. Basil was a clever and ruthless man, and he understood that he was running out of options inside his own empire. So he looked outside it. Far to the north, beyond the Black Sea, beyond the endless steppe, lay the lands of the Rus, the realm centered on Kiev, where Norse adventurers and Slavic peoples had blended into a powerful new state. The Rus had a long and not entirely friendly history with Constantinople. Twice in living memory, their fleets had descended the rivers and the Black Sea to raid the very suburbs of the imperial capital, and a series of treaties had been hammered out to regulate the trade and the violence between them. The Byzantines knew these northerners well, knew their courage and their greed, and knew above all that they fought like nothing else in the world. Their ruler now was a formidable warlord named Vladimir, Prince of Kiev, a man with a hardened army of Scandinavian and Rus fighting men and an ambition that matched his strength. He had only recently seized his own throne by killing a brother, a man as ruthless as Basil himself. Basil sent envoys racing north with an extraordinary proposal, a gamble born of pure desperation. He would offer something no emperor had ever offered to a barbarian prince before, and in exchange, he would ask for an army of men whose only law was the axe. The deal they struck would echo for 4 centuries. It would bind the frozen north to the golden south in a bond of blood, gold, and faith. And it would create the most famous bodyguard in the history of the world. To understand it, we have to follow the bargain itself, clause by extraordinary clause. Promptin. A young grim Byzantine emperor in purple and gold robes standing alone at a high palace window at night, gazing across dark water toward the distant glow of an enemy army's campfires on the far shore. Documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index, 3, chapter title. The bargain of 988, text ease. The deal that created the Varangian Guard was one of the most consequential bargains of the early medieval world, and like all great bargains, both sides drove a hard price. Vladimir of Kiev would send Basil 6,000 of his fighting men, the famed Rus warriors, a number recorded in the sources and large enough to tip the balance of a civil war. In return, Basil agreed to 2 things almost unheard of. The first was that Vladimir would convert to Christianity, abandoning the old gods of the north and the Slavic pantheon, and bring his entire realm into the Orthodox faith. The second was the truly astonishing concession. Basil would give Vladimir his own sister in marriage. Her name was Anna Porphyrogenita, and that final word mattered more than gold. Porphyrogenita meant born in the purple, born in the special chamber of the imperial palace reserved for the children of a reigning emperor. She was a princess of the most exalted blood in the Christian world, and Byzantine emperors had guarded such women jealously for generations, refusing to marry them off to foreigners no matter how powerful. To hand a born in the purple princess to a northern warlord was, by the standards of Constantinople, almost scandalous. It tells you exactly how frightened Basil truly was. The marriage and the conversion went hand in hand. According to the chronicles, when Vladimir had taken the city of Cherson and pressed his demands, the agreement was sealed, he was baptized, and Anna traveled north to a husband and a court utterly unlike anything she had known. Her arrival would help cement Christianity across the lands of the Rus, shaping the religious future of what would one day become Russia and Ukraine for 1,000 years. But for Basil, the prize was the army. The 6,000 Rus warriors sailed and marched south down the great river road and arrived in time to save him. In the winter, Basil moved with brutal speed. He ferried his new northern soldiers across the water under cover of darkness and fell upon a rebel force at Chrysopolis, just across from the capital, catching them unprepared and cutting them to pieces. It was a slaughter. The Rus fought with a ferocity the Byzantines had rarely witnessed, and the rebel detachment was annihilated. But the great test was still to come, because Bardas Phocas himself, with the main rebel army, still stood between Basil and survival. The young emperor had bought himself an army of foreigners with his own sister's hand and his rival's soul. Now he had to see whether the gamble would hold on the open field of battle against the finest general in the empire. The answer would come the following spring on the plain of Abydos, and it would be decided in a single, almost theatrical instant. Prompt N. A solemn medieval ceremony showing a Byzantine princess in jeweled imperial regalia being presented to a tall Rus warlord before an Orthodox altar, priests and torches all around, while ranks of Norse warriors wait in the background. Documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene, index, fall, text ease. In the spring of 989, the two armies faced each other near Abydos, on the shore of the Hellespont. Basil had come in person, and beside him stood his Rus warriors, the men who had already proven their worth in the night slaughter at Chrysopolis. Across the field waited Bardas Phocas and the great rebel host, confident, experienced, and led by a man who had every reason to believe the throne was within his grasp. What happened next reads like a scene from a saga, and yet it appears in the sober record of the chroniclers. Phocas, that giant of a man, rode out toward the imperial line, perhaps to challenge Basil directly, perhaps to rally his men for a decisive charge. And then, in the middle of the field, in full view of both armies, he simply collapsed and died. Some sources say he was struck down by sudden illness, a seizure or a stroke. Others whispered of poison slipped into his cup by his own people. Whatever the cause, the effect was instant and total. The rebel army, leaderless, its towering champion dead in the dust before a blow had truly fallen, dissolved. The rebellion collapsed almost in a single morning. Basil II had survived. He had crushed the most dangerous threat of his reign, and he had done it with the help of 6,000 Northmen who had crossed half a continent to fight for him. A lesser ruler might have paid the foreigners off and sent them home. Basil did the opposite. He had learned something in those terrifying months that he would never forget. These men who spoke no Greek, who had no kin in the city, who could not be drawn into the endless conspiracies of the court, were the most reliable soldiers he had ever commanded. They had no reason to betray him because they had no future in Byzantium except the one his gold provided. So Basil kept them. He took the best of them into his personal service, the warriors who would guard his very person, who would stand outside his bedchamber and walk at his side in procession. Over the years that followed, this corps of northern warriors hardened into a permanent institution, an elite bodyguard recruited from the lands of the Rus and, increasingly, from Scandinavia itself. They would become known to history as the Varangian Guard, from a Norse word, Varangur, meaning something like a sworn companion, a man bound by oath. Basil the Bulgar Slayer went on to reign for nearly half a century, expanding the empire to its greatest extent in centuries, and through it all his axe-bearing Northmen stood at his shoulder. The institution he created out of one desperate winter's bargain would outlast him by 400 years. But who exactly were these men? And how did a fisherman's son or a chieftain's outlawed brother from the far north come to stand guard over the Lord of the Romans? Prompt in. An epic medieval battlefield at dawn showing the towering rebel general Bardas Phocas collapsing dead from his horse mid-charge as two great armies watch in shock. Banners and dust everywhere, Norse warriors in the imperial line, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene, Index. Chapter title: Men of the North, Textes. Who were the Varangians? The simplest answer is that they were Norsemen, but the truth is richer and stranger than that. They came from the whole sprawling world of the Scandinavian diaspora, the great age of expansion we call the Viking Age. They were Swedes from the lakes and forests around the Baltic, Norwegians from the long fjord-cut coast, Danes from the flat, fertile lands of the south, and the Russ, those people of Scandinavian descent who had settled along the rivers of the east and mingled with Slavic peoples to forge a new identity. Later, after the world changed in 1066, there would even be Anglo-Saxons from England among them. What united these men was not nationality, a concept that barely existed, but a shared culture of the sea, the sword, and the sworn oath. They were the same restless, fearless men who in this very age were raiding the coasts of England and France, settling Iceland, reaching Greenland, and stepping ashore in North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Some came for glory, many came for gold. A great number came because they had no choice. In the harsh, honor-bound society of the North, a man who lost a feud, who killed the wrong rival, who ended up on the losing side of a struggle for a kingdom, might be declared an outlaw, stripped of protection, forced to flee or die. For such men, the road south to Miklagard was a road to a new life, a place where a strong arm and a sharp axe could buy not just survival, but a fortune. The journey itself was a feat of endurance that we can scarcely imagine today. They did not sail around Europe. They went through it, down its rivers, on a route the sources call the road from the Varangians to the Greeks. From the Baltic, they pushed inland, navigating great northern rivers until they reached the mighty Dnieper, the river highway that ran south through the lands of the Rus, all the way to the Black Sea. They rowed and sailed their long, shallow boats down its length, past Kiev, past the edge of the known world. The most dangerous part came at a series of cataracts, savage rapids where the river crashed over rocks and no boat could pass. There the Rus had to haul their vessels out of the water and carry them, and their cargo, overland for miles, all the while watched by the fierce nomads of the steppe who lay in wait to ambush travelers at exactly these choke points. A Byzantine emperor of an earlier generation, Constantine VII, had even written down the names of these terrible rapids in a famous treatise on governing the empire, recording both their Norse and their Slavic names. A small detail that proves how well the Greeks understood the perilous road by which their northern soldiers came to them. Men died on this journey. They drowned in the rapids, fell to raiders, sickened, and were buried on lonely riverbanks. But those who survived emerged at last onto the Black Sea and then sailed south until they saw it, the great city itself, its walls and domes glittering on the water. For a man raised in a turf longhouse under gray northern skies, the sight of Constantinople must have been almost beyond comprehension, a vision of wealth and grandeur from another world. And he had come to guard it. Promptin. A fleet of Norse longboats being hauled overland by straining bearded warriors past treacherous river rapids, water crashing over rocks beside them, dark forests, and watching figures on the distant banks, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene Index, 6 texts. We should not imagine these men as the horned, helmeted savages of cartoon and legend. The real Varangians were professional soldiers, and over time they became some of the best-equipped warriors in the world. When they arrived, they came as they were, hardy fighters in mail shirts or leather, carrying the round shields and long swords and great axes of the north. But in imperial service they were paid, and paid well, in the silver and gold of the richest treasury on earth. A wealthy Varangian could afford the finest arms and armor money could buy, supplementing his northern gear with Byzantine equipment. Their signature weapon, the one that gave them their nickname, was the axe. Not the small hand axe of a woodcutter, but the great two-handed Dane axe, a fearsome weapon with a broad crescent blade on a long haft, capable of splitting a shield, a helmet, and the skull beneath it in a single swing. To wield it well, a man had to abandon his own shield and trust entirely to his comrades and his own ferocity, holding the long haft in both hands and bringing the blade down with the full weight of his body behind it. The Byzantines, who had names for everything, called them the Pelakiphoroi, the axe-bearers, and sometimes simply the axe-bearing barbarians of the imperial guard. In ceremony, these axes rested on their shoulders as they flanked the emperor, polished until they blazed in the light, gleaming symbols of his power. Foreign ambassadors brought before the throne would pass between rows of these towering northerners, and the message was unmistakable. In battle, those same ceremonial axes became instruments of slaughter. Life in the guard was, by the standards of the age, extraordinary. A Varangian served the emperor directly. He lived in the capital, in or near the great palace complex, in the most luxurious city in the world. He ate well, drank well, and was paid a salary that no farmer or fisherman in the north could dream of. Beyond the regular pay, there were bonuses and gifts, the spoils of campaigns, and special customary rights that we will come to. Many Varangians served for a number of years, amassed a small fortune, and then sailed home to the north as wealthy men, buying land, building halls, marrying well, and earning enormous prestige among their countrymen. To have served in the guard of the Greek emperor was a mark of the highest distinction. The sagas are full of men who went south poor and came home rich and renowned, their reputations made forever by their years in Miklagard. But the guard was not a holiday. These men earned their gold. They were the emperor's last line of defense, the troops he committed when a battle hung in the balance, the soldiers sent into the most dangerous breaches and the most desperate stands. They were expected to fight, to bleed, and if necessary to die, to the last man, around the body of the emperor. And it was precisely in war that the Varangian Guard built the terrifying reputation that would ring across the medieval world for 400 years. Prompt N. A detailed portrait of a fully equipped Varangian guardsman in gleaming mail and lamellar armor holding a massive two-handed Dane axe across his body, a round shield slung on his back, Byzantine palace gilding behind him, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Sabo, scene index, Mabo, chapter title. The axe-bearers at war, text ease. On the battlefield, the Varangian Guard was a weapon of last resort, and everyone who faced them knew it. The Byzantine army was a sophisticated machine, with light and heavy cavalry, archers, engineers, and a complex science of war that the Greeks had refined over centuries. But within that machine, the Varangians occupied a special and fearsome place. They were the emperor's own. They did not skirmish or maneuver subtly. They were shock troops, held in reserve until the decisive moment, then unleashed in a single, overwhelming charge designed to shatter whatever stood before them. Imagine the experience of an enemy soldier on the receiving end. You have fought all morning against the disciplined Byzantine lines. You are tired, your shield arm aches, the dust is in your throat. And then a horn sounds, and through the ranks comes a body of men unlike any you have seen, tall northerners with braided hair and grim painted shields, raising those huge axes over their heads. They do not run. They come at a steady, relentless walk that is somehow more terrifying than any charge, chanting in a language you cannot understand, beating their weapons against their shields in a slow thunder. And then they are upon you, and the axes fall, and they split shields like kindling and helmets like eggshells. And the men around you are dying faster than you can comprehend. The princess historian Anna Komnene, who saw the guard in her own father's service and described it in her great history, the Alexiad, wrote of the axe-bearing barbarians as men who regarded loyalty to the emperors and the protection of their persons as a sacred trust handed down from father to son. She portrays them as utterly devoted, almost frighteningly so, men who would not break and would not flee. In one famous episode of imperial history, a usurper trying to seize the throne found that the Varangians simply would not abandon the legitimate emperor, no matter the bribes or the odds. Their value lay precisely in that immovability. Against a numerically superior enemy, a wedge of Varangians could punch through a line that other troops could not crack. In a rout, they could form the rock around which a broken army might rally, standing firm while everything around them dissolved into panic. In a siege, they were the first into the breach and the last to retreat, and in the close, murderous fighting on the walls and in the streets, their great axes did terrible work. They campaigned across the whole sprawling frontier of the empire, in the Balkans against Bulgars and Slavs, in the east against Arabs and later the Seljuk Turks, in Italy and Sicily against Normans and Lombards. Wherever the emperor's enemies were thickest, the axe-bearers were sent. And though they did not win every battle, for no soldiers do, they earned a name that traveled faster than any army. To hire the Varangians was to field the most feared close combat troops in the Mediterranean world. To face them was to face death in its most personal and brutal form. Prompt in. A ferocious medieval battle scene with a wedge of Varangian warriors smashing through an enemy shield wall, great axes mid-swing cleaving shields and helmets, splinters and dust filling the air, terrified enemy faces, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Or scene index, there's texties. There is a strange and revealing truth at the heart of the Varangians' loyalty, one that fascinated the Byzantines themselves. The Guard was famous not for its devotion to any particular emperor, but for its devotion to the office of emperor, the throne, not the man who happened to sit on it. This distinction may sound subtle, but it had savage consequences. If a reigning emperor was overthrown and killed, whether by an army, a mob, or a conspiracy of his own court, the Varangians would not throw away their lives in a hopeless last stand once the matter was truly decided. Instead, once a new man was firmly seated on the throne and acclaimed as emperor, the Guard would transfer its absolute loyalty to him, as if nothing had changed. They served the purple, not the person. To a modern sensibility, this can seem like cynicism, even treachery, but to the Varangians it was the opposite. It was the purest possible form of professional honor. They were sworn to protect the emperor of the Romans, and whoever legitimately held that title commanded their oath. Their loyalty was real and total, but it was loyalty to an institution that outlived any individual ruler. And this was, in fact, exactly what made them so valuable to the empire. A guard loyal to a man might be drawn into his private schemes, might help him cling to power against the will of the state, might become a tool of tyranny, or a kingmaker in its own right. But a guard loyal to the office could be trusted by the whole apparatus of empire, because it would always serve whoever rightfully held power and would never become a faction unto itself. They had no dynasty to advance, no claimant of their own, no Byzantine bloodline to defend. This is the deep logic behind why foreigners made the perfect guard. A native bodyguard might dream of putting its own commander on the throne, as had happened again and again in Roman history with disastrous results. The Varangians could never realistically aspire to rule the Romans, and everyone knew it. They were outsiders, and their outsider status was the very source of their trustworthiness. They could be given access to the emperor's person, to the inner chambers of the palace, to the treasury and the regalia, precisely because they could never use that access to seize the empire for themselves. Their ambition began and ended with gold and glory, and the empire had plenty of both to give. So they guarded the sleeping emperor through the night, stood behind his throne by day, escorted him through the city, and followed him to war, a wall of foreign steel around the most contested seat of power in the world. And in return, beyond their fabulous pay, they enjoyed a set of privileges so peculiar that the Norse remembered them in their own language for centuries afterward. Prompton, two stern Varangian guards in ceremonial armor standing perfectly still at the foot of a magnificent golden Byzantine throne in a vast mosaic-covered hall, the throne empty and gleaming between them, beams of light from high windows, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index. Chapter title. The Legend of Harald Hardrada, text ease. Of all the thousands of Northmen who served in the Varangian Guard, one stands above the rest, a figure so large that he seems to belong half to history and half to legend. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, and the world would come to know him by a darker title, Harald Hardrada, Harald the Hard Ruler, the Ruthless. His story is the story of the Guard at its most glamorous and most deadly, and we know it in vivid detail because it was recorded by the great Icelandic chronicler Snorri Sturluson in his collection of sagas, the Heimskringla. Harald's path to Constantinople began in disaster. He was a Norwegian of royal blood, the half-brother of King Olaf, the king who would later become Norway's patron saint. In the year 1030, when Harald was still a teenager, around 15 years old, he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad, where King Olaf was killed and their cause was crushed. Wounded and on the losing side, the young Harald was forced to flee his homeland. He went east, first to the court of the Rus in Kiev, where he served the prince and learned the trade of war. And then, like so many ambitious Northmen before him, he traveled south to Miklagard to seek his fortune in the service of the Greek emperor. He arrived around the year 1034 and joined the Varangian Guard, and according to the sagas, he rose quickly to prominence, even command. He had everything the Guard prized in a man: royal blood, towering height, immense strength, and a hunger that would never be satisfied. The Norse poets who served alongside him, and Harald himself was a gifted poet, composed verses about his deeds that would later be woven into the saga, so that some of what we know comes down to us in the form of poetry composed by the very men who stood beside him in the line. Over the following decade, Harald fought across the breadth of the empire and beyond. The sagas, with their characteristic blend of fact and heroic exaggeration, send him campaigning in the Mediterranean against pirates and rebellious cities, in Sicily and southern Italy, and even, in some tellings, on pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the River Jordan. He fought in dozens of battles. He captured cities, won duels, and according to legend used cunning stratagems worthy of a saga hero, once supposedly setting fire to a besieged town by tying burning material to captured birds that flew home to their nests under the eaves. How much of this is literal truth, and how much is the embroidery of storytellers we cannot fully know. But the core is solid. Harald served in the Guard for roughly a decade. He fought hard, and above all, he grew enormously, fabulously rich. This last point is crucial, and it brings us to one of the strangest privileges the Varangians enjoyed, a custom that Harald exploited to the full and that the Norse remembered with a special word of their own. Prompton, a commanding young Norse warrior with long, fair hair and a scarred face standing on the deck of a war galley in the Mediterranean, sword drawn, the coastline of a besieged city burning in the distance behind him, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index 10, text ease. The custom was called, in the Norse tongue, pollutasvarf, a word the sagas preserve and that has puzzled scholars ever since. It seems to mean something like the palace plunder or the going through of the halls, and it referred to an extraordinary right granted to the Varangian Guard. When an emperor died, The guardsmen were permitted, by ancient custom, to walk through the imperial palace and take for themselves as much treasure as they could carry. It was a kind of bonus written in gold, a windfall that came with the passing of each ruler. According to the saga of Harold, he exercised this right no fewer than 3 times during his years in the Guard, as 3 emperors died in succession during the turbulent middle decades of the 11th century. Each time, Harold walked the palace and gathered up a fortune in gold and precious things. We should picture what that actually meant. The imperial palace of Constantinople was not a single building, but a sprawling complex of halls, chapels, treasuries, and courtyards stuffed with the accumulated wealth of centuries, gold plate and silver vessels, jeweled crosses, silks shot through with gold thread, gemstones, and coins beyond counting. To be turned loose in such a place, even for a few hours, and told to carry away whatever your arms could hold, was a windfall that could make a poor man rich for life. For a man as strong and as greedy as Harold, 3 such occasions amounted to a king's ransom many times over. Beyond this, his regular pay, his share of campaign plunder, and the gifts heaped upon a successful commander made him one of the wealthiest men in the entire northern world. Snorri tells us that Harold sent his accumulated treasure north for safekeeping, shipping it to the court of the Rus in Kiev, where the prince held it in trust for him. By the time Harold decided to leave Byzantine service, he had amassed riches beyond anything a Norwegian prince had ever possessed. But leaving was not simple. The sagas tell a dramatic story of how Harold, when he wished to depart, fell out of favor with the imperial court, was imprisoned, and had to escape, even, in one vivid tale, helping to blind a deposed emperor before slipping out of the city. Whatever the precise truth, around the year 1042 or 1043, Harold did leave Constantinople, sailing north up the rivers he had come down a decade earlier, a poor exile no longer but a war-hardened champion laden with treasure. He returned first to Kiev, where he married the prince's daughter and reclaimed his fortune, and then continued north to Scandinavia. There, using his wealth and his fearsome reputation, he made himself king of Norway, ruling with the iron hand that earned him the name Hardrada, the hard ruler. The boy who had fled a lost battle now sat upon a throne, and he had built his power on the gold of Constantinople and the skills he had learned in the Varangian Guard. His story might have ended there, a saga hero crowned and triumphant. But Harald Hardrada was a man who never stopped reaching for more, and his hunger for one final greater crown would carry him to a windswept field in England and into the very hinge of European history. Prompton. A Norse warrior loading heavy chests of gold treasure onto a longship at a river dock under torchlight, his men hauling sacks of plunder aboard, the great city's walls receding behind them in the dusk, documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index, La Seta, chapter title, 1066 and the end of an age, text, ease. In the year 1066, Harald Hardrada, now an aging but still formidable king of Norway, made the gamble that would end his life and, in a strange way, close the Viking Age itself. The throne of England had fallen vacant with the death of Edward the Confessor, and a tangle of rival claimants reached for it. One was Harold Godwinson, the powerful English earl-crowned king in London. Another was William, Duke of Normandy, who would soon launch his own famous invasion. And the third was Harald Hardrada of Norway, who pressed an old and tenuous claim to the English crown and decided to take it by force, as he had taken everything else in his life. In September of 1066, he sailed for England with a great fleet and a hardened army, the last of the great Viking invasions of the West. He landed in the north and at first carried all before him, defeating the local English forces in a sharp battle near York. For a moment, it seemed the old warrior might add England to his conquests, but King Harold Godwinson reacted with astonishing speed, marching his army north from London at a furious pace and falling upon the Norwegians where they least expected it, at a river crossing called Stamford Bridge. The battle that followed on the 25th of September 1066 was savage. The sagas preserve the famous image of a lone Norwegian warrior holding the narrow bridge against the entire English army, cutting down man after man until he was finally killed from beneath. In the fighting, Harald Hardrada was struck in the throat by an arrow and died. His invasion collapsed. Of the great fleet that had sailed from Norway, only a fraction of the men returned home. The chroniclers say it took just a handful of ships to carry away the survivors. The man who had served in the Varangian Guard, who had grown rich in Constantinople and made himself a king, died on English soil. His dream of empire ended in the mud beside a river. And here history turns on a knife edge. Just 19 days after Stamford Bridge, the exhausted, depleted army of Harold Godwinson had to march all the way back south to face William of Normandy at Hastings, where the English king was killed and England fell to the Normans. Many historians have wondered whether Harold might have beaten William had he not first been forced to destroy Harald Hardrada in the north. In that sense, the death of an old Varangian on a bridge in Yorkshire helped reshape the entire future of England and of Europe. The Viking Age, the long era of northern raiders and adventurers, is often said to have died with Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. But for the Varangian Guard far away in Constantinople, the events of 1066 would have a very different and unexpected consequence. Prompton. A dramatic medieval battle at a wooden river bridge, an aged Norse king in a gleaming helmet falling backward struck by an arrow as English soldiers surge across, autumn light and chaos, banners and spears against a gray sky, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene, Index 12, Text Ease. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 did not just change England. It created almost overnight a new generation of exiles looking for a fight and a place to take their revenge. When William the Conqueror seized the English throne, he dispossessed the old Anglo-Saxon warrior aristocracy. The Thanes and housecarls who had survived the slaughter of Hastings found their lands confiscated, their families dishonored, their world overturned by French-speaking foreigners. For proud fighting men raised in the warrior culture of late Saxon England, life under Norman rule was intolerable. And so many of them did exactly what defeated Northmen had done for generations. They went east to Constantinople to take service with the emperor. In the decades after 1066, the composition of the Varangian Guard shifted. Where once it had been dominated by Swedes, Russ, and other Scandinavians, it now absorbed wave after wave of Anglo-Saxon and English exiles, men with names like Godwin and Edgar, who brought with them their own traditions, their long swords and their broad axes, and above all, their burning hatred of the Normans. The Guard became increasingly an English institution, so much so that some later sources speak of the English of the Varangian Guard almost as a distinct body. There is even a tradition recorded in later sources that these English exiles established a settlement of their own somewhere on the Black Sea coast, a place sometimes called New England, a far-flung colony of the dispossessed. How literally we should take this is uncertain, but the broad pattern is clear. The Guard that had begun as a corps of Rus warriors sent by Vladimir of Kiev had transformed over the course of a century into a refuge for the defeated of the entire northern world. It is one of history's great ironies. The descendants of Vikings who had once raided England now stood shoulder to shoulder in Constantinople with Englishmen fleeing the descendants of Vikings who had conquered Normandy. For the Normans were themselves of Norse blood, the offspring of Vikings who had settled in northern France a century and a half earlier and taken on French ways. So in a sense, the Anglo-Saxon exiles had crossed half the world only to find themselves once more in the company of Northmen, this time as comrades rather than enemies. The Guard was a kind of museum of the North's defeated causes, a gathering of men whose homelands had cast them out, all of them finding a final purpose in the gold and the glory of the Roman emperor. There was a grim poetry to it. All these dispossessed warriors from the cold edge of the world, gathered together at the warm center of it, their old quarrels dissolved in the shared service of a foreign throne. For a time, the institution flourished as strongly as ever, these grim English axemen proving every bit as loyal and ferocious as the Scandinavians before them. They fought for the Comnenian emperors in the great struggles of the 12th century, against Normans and Turks and Pechenegs. But the world that sustained the Guard was beginning to change, and a catastrophe was approaching Constantinople that no wall of axes could turn back, a blow that would come not from the empire's enemies, but from its supposed friends. Prompt in. A group of grim Anglo-Saxon exiles with long mustaches and broad axes arriving by ship at the harbor of Constantinople, their faces hard with grief and anger, the great walls of the city looming above them, documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene Index. 13, Chapter, Title. The Long Decline. Text, Ease. For 2 centuries, the Varangian Guard had been the unbreakable shield of the emperors, and Constantinople itself had stood unconquered behind its mighty walls for the better part of 1,000 years. No enemy, not Persian, not Arab, not Bulgar, not Rus, had ever taken the great city by storm. But in the year 1204, the unthinkable happened, and it happened at the hands of the very people who shared the Varangians' Christian faith. The Fourth Crusade had set out, in theory, to fight for the Holy Land. Instead, diverted by Venetian ambition, dynastic intrigue, and naked greed, the Crusader army turned aside and attacked Constantinople itself. In April of 1204, after a first failed assault, the Crusaders breached the city's sea walls and poured inside. The Varangian Guard was there, and according to the sources they fought, defending the emperor and the palace as they had sworn to do. But the situation was hopeless. The emperors of this twilight period were weak, divided, and constantly betrayed by their own court. One fled, another was deposed, and the defense collapsed into chaos. The Guard could hold a breach or shatter a battle line, but it could not save an empire rotting from within and abandoned by its own leaders. The Crusaders took Constantinople and subjected it to one of the most infamous sackings in history. For 3 days, they pillaged the greatest city in Christendom, stripping the churches of their treasures, smashing ancient statues for their bronze, carrying off relics and gold and works of art that had accumulated over nearly 900 years. The great cathedral was desecrated. The imperial tombs were broken open. An empire that had stood since the days of the Caesars was shattered, carved up among the conquerors. And though a Byzantine state would be restored decades later, it would never recover its former power. For the Varangian Guard, 1204 was the beginning of the end. The restored empire of the later 13th and 14th centuries was a poorer, smaller, weaker thing, fighting for its survival on shrinking frontiers. The flow of adventurous Northmen down the river roads had long since slowed. The Viking Age was a memory. Scandinavia had become a land of settled Christian kingdoms, and the old routes and reasons that had once sent young warriors south had faded. The Guard still existed in name, and the axe-bearers are still mentioned in the sources for a time, but they were a shadow of what they had been, fewer in number, less central, increasingly just one ceremonial detail among the trappings of a fading court. By the time the empire entered its final doomed century, the Varangian Guard had dwindled away, its members absorbed, its function lost, its great age long over. The wall of northern steel that had guarded the emperors for 400 years simply faded into the twilight of the empire it had served. Prompt N. The sack of Constantinople in 1204, Crusader knights storming through a burning palace as a few Varangian guards make a desperate last stand on a marble staircase, smoke and falling treasures all around, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene Index 14. Texties. It is worth pausing to mourn, just for a moment, what was lost. The Varangian Guard was not merely a military unit. It was a living bridge between two worlds that could hardly have been more different. On one side stood the cold, austere, oath-bound culture of the Scandinavian North, a world of longhouses and sagas, of feuds and honor and the open sea. On the other stood the gilded, ancient, intricate civilization of Byzantium, heir to Rome and Greece, steeped in Orthodox Christianity and imperial ceremony, the most sophisticated state in Europe. For 400 years, individual men crossed that bridge in the flesh, carrying their axes and their oaths from one world into the other. They learned Greek words and Byzantine ways. They worshipped in the great cathedral. They saw mosaics and silks and machines and books such as their homelands had never imagined. And then many of them carried it all back north again, in their memories, in their wealth, and in the stories they told around the fires of the long northern winters. Those stories mattered. They became part of the saga tradition, woven into the great literature that Snorri Sturluson and others would write down in Iceland in the 13th century. The image of Miklagard, the golden city in the south, the fortunes to be won there, the marvels to be seen, lodged itself permanently in the imagination of the North. The Varangian connection helped knit the medieval world together, carrying goods, ideas, coins, and faith along the great river roads between the Baltic and the Black Sea. Byzantine silver flowed north and turns up today in hoards buried across Scandinavia. Northern furs and slaves and amber and honey and wax flowed south, traded in the markets of the great city for the silks and spices and silver of the East. And the conversion of the Rus to Orthodox Christianity, sealed in that very bargain of 988 that created the Guard, shaped the entire religious and cultural destiny of Eastern Europe for the next 1,000 years. The faith that Vladimir adopted as part of the price of his warriors would, in time, define the spiritual life of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, give rise to a magnificent tradition of icons and architecture and chant, and bind those lands to the cultural world of Byzantium long after the empire itself had fallen. Few bargains in history have rippled so far. A desperate emperor bought an army, and in doing so helped baptize a civilization. The Varangians, in other words, were not a footnote. They sat at one of the great crossroads of medieval history, where North met South, pagan met Christian, and the world of the Vikings touched the world of the Romans. When the Guard faded, that bridge did not vanish all at once, but a particular and extraordinary chapter of human connection drew to a close. And yet, remarkably, these men did not disappear without leaving something behind. Something you can still see and touch today, something carved by their own restless hands into the stone of the most beautiful building in their world. Prompt on. A symbolic split landscape showing a cold Scandinavian fjord with a longhouse on one side and the golden domes of Constantinople on the other, joined by a winding river road across the middle. Dramatic clouds above, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene Index 15, Chapter. Title: The Marks They Left Behind. Text as: Walk today into the great cathedral that the Byzantines called Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, and you stand inside the single most magnificent building of the medieval world. For nearly 1,000 years, it was the largest enclosed space ever built, a cavern of light and gold and soaring stone, its impossible dome seeming to hang from heaven on a ring of windows. Emperors were crowned here. The most sacred rituals of the empire unfolded beneath this dome. And here, in the upper gallery, where the imperial family and their attendants would stand during the long ceremonies, the Varangians left their mark. Carved into the marble parapet of the south gallery is a piece of graffiti, scratched letters worn now by 1,000 years of time, but still legible to those who know how to read them. They are not Greek letters. They are runes, the angular alphabet of the Norse, and they spell out, as far as scholars can tell, a fragment of a name. The most famous reading gives the name Halfdan. The full inscription is damaged and debated, but the consensus is that it once said something like, Halfdan carved these runes, or Halfdan was here. The timeless graffiti of a bored guardsman, scratched into the stone during some endless ceremony when the chanting droned on and a young northerner's mind wandered home. There is a second runic inscription elsewhere in the gallery, fainter still, bearing what may be another name. Think about what that means. A man from the far north, a Varangian on duty in the holiest church of the Christian East, standing through hour after hour of ritual in a language he barely understood, surrounded by a wealth and grandeur beyond anything in his homeland, reached out with a knife or a tool and did the most human thing imaginable. He carved his name into the marble, an act of vandalism and an act of immortality all at once. Halfdan could not have known that his idol's scratching would outlast the empire he served, outlast his own civilization, and still be there for travelers to find 1,000 years later. But it is. You can stand in that gallery today and see it. The runes of a Viking guardsman in the marble of Constantinople, the most poignant and personal trace these men left of themselves. It is not the only physical evidence. There is a great marble lion, originally from the harbor of Athens and later carried off to Venice, that also bears worn Norse runes carved by Varangians who passed through. There are coins, weapons, and burials scattered along the river roads. But it is Halfdan's name in Hagia Sophia that speaks most directly across the centuries, one man's small rebellion against the boredom of duty, preserved forever in the stone of the great city he had crossed the world to guard. Prompton. An extreme close-up of ancient Norse runic graffiti carved into a polished white marble balustrade in a vast cathedral gallery. Soft golden light raking across the worn, scratched letters, the immense domed interior glowing softly behind, documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index, 16, text as. Beyond stone and coin, the deepest traces the Varangians left were written in words. We owe much of what we know about them to two extraordinary bodies of literature produced at opposite ends of their world. And reading them side by side is like hearing the same story told in two completely different voices. From the Byzantine side comes the Alexiad, written by the Princess Anna Komnene, daughter of the Emperor Alexios I. Anna was one of the most remarkable figures of the medieval world, a woman of immense learning who, after a failed bid for power, retired to write a sweeping history of her father's reign. In its pages, she describes the Varangians with the cool, slightly condescending precision of a Byzantine aristocrat observing the barbarians her family employed. She tells us of their axes, their loyalty, their role in her father's wars, and through her educated Greek eyes we see the Guard as the Empire saw it, a useful, formidable, faintly exotic instrument of imperial power. From the northern side comes the saga tradition, above all the Heimskringla of Snorri Sturluson, the Icelandic chieftain and poet who in the 13th century gathered the oral traditions of the Norwegian kings into a literary masterpiece. In Snorri's pages, the same world appears utterly transformed. Here, Constantinople is Miklagard, a glittering land of opportunity at the edge of the map, and the Varangians are heroes of romance and adventure, men like Harold Hardrada, whose exploits are told with the relish of a people celebrating their own. Where Anna sees barbarians in imperial service, Snorri sees champions winning glory and gold in a distant golden land. The same emperor who appears in the Greek sources as a sacred and untouchable figure becomes, in the saga, simply a rich foreign king to be served, outwitted, and on occasion robbed. The same axe that the Byzantines saw as the badge of their loyal guard becomes, in the north, the proud symbol of a warrior who had been to the great city and returned to tell the tale. Neither source is perfectly reliable. Anna writes with the bias of her family and her class, and Snorri writes 2 centuries after the events, weaving fact and legend into a seamless, heroic tapestry. The historian's task is to read them against each other, against the chronicles, against the archaeology, the coins and the runes and the weapons, and to triangulate toward the truth that lies somewhere between the Greek princess and the Icelandic poet. And what emerges from that careful work is a picture all the more remarkable for being real. These men truly existed. They truly made that staggering journey. They truly stood guard over emperors, fought in real battles, grew rich on real gold, and carved real names into real marble. The legend, for once, rests on solid historical ground. The Varangian Guard is not a myth dressed up as history. It is history vivid enough to feel like myth. And that raises a final question, the question that has haunted this whole story from its first dramatic image. Why does it move us so deeply, this tale of axe-bearing Northmen in the Golden City? Prompt Yen. A medieval scriptorium scene with 2 manuscripts side by side, one an ornate Byzantine illuminated Greek chronicle, and one a weathered Norse saga manuscript, candlelight illuminating the aged parchment pages, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index, Paspan, chapter, title. Loyalty and the stranger, text ease. There is a paradox at the center of the Varangian story that is worth dwelling on because it tells us something profound about power, trust, and human nature. The emperors of Byzantium were the most powerful men on earth, and yet they could not trust the people closest to them. Their own families plotted against them. Their own generals dreamed of the throne. Their own ministers and courtiers wove endless conspiracies in the corridors of the palace. The people who shared their language, their faith, their culture, the people who should by every natural instinct have been their truest supporters, were in fact the very people most likely to murder them. And so they turned, in their need, to strangers, to men who did not speak their language, did not share their history, did not understand the subtle currents of their politics, to rough northern warriors from the far edge of the known world, men they could barely communicate with, men whose gods until recently had been Odin and Thor. And these strangers proved more loyal than any kinsman. It is a pattern that recurs throughout history, this reliance of rulers on foreign guards, from the praetorians of Rome to the Swiss guard of the popes to the mercenary corps of countless courts. There is a hard truth buried in it. Sometimes the outsider, precisely because he has no stake in the local game of power, can be trusted in ways the insider never can. The Varangian could be given the keys to the palace because he could never aspire to own it. His foreignness, the very thing that made him strange and other, was the foundation of his trustworthiness. But there is something more here than cold political calculation, and the Varangians themselves seem to have felt it. Their loyalty was not merely the obedience of hired men. The sources, both Greek and Norse, describe a genuine code of honor, a fierce pride in their oath, a sense that to guard the emperor was a sacred trust worthy of a warrior's whole devotion. They served the office of emperor with an almost religious seriousness, and they died for it when they had to. These were men far from home, cut off from the world that had made them, often exiles who could never return. In the Guard, they found a new family, a new purpose, a new identity forged in the brotherhood of the axe and the oath. There is something deeply human in that. The way men torn from their roots can build a new loyalty, a new home, out of duty and comradeship and the shared danger of the watch. The lonely guardsman carving his name in the marble of Hagia Sophia was not only fighting boredom, he was perhaps insisting that he had been here, that he had mattered, that this stranger from the north had stood at the heart of the world and left his mark upon it. Prompton. A lone Varangian guard standing solitary watch through the night in a vast empty marble palace hall lit by a single oil lamp, his great axe in hand, his face thoughtful and far away, deep shadows all around, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Han, Scene Index, Yard 18, Text Tease. Consider, too, what the existence of the Varangian Guard reveals about the medieval world itself, a world we too often imagine as small, isolated, and parochial. We picture medieval people as rooted to their villages, dying within a few miles of where they were born, knowing nothing of lands beyond the horizon. The Varangians shatter that picture completely. Here were men who traveled thousands of miles, from the Arctic edge of Europe to the gates of Asia, who knew intimately both the frozen fjords of Norway and the sun-baked shores of the Mediterranean, who had stood in a turf longhouse and beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, who could perhaps swear an oath in Norse, count their pay in Greek, and curse in the tongues of a dozen peoples they had fought. The medieval world was connected in ways that astonish us when we look closely. Trade routes ran from China to Scandinavia. Coins minted in Baghdad turn up in Viking graves on the Baltic. A man born in the north could end his life guarding an emperor in the east, and a princess born in the purple of Constantinople could end hers as the wife of a prince in Kiev. The river road from the Varangians to the Greeks was not a trickle, but a highway, carrying people and goods and ideas along its length for centuries. The Varangian Guard is the human face of that connectedness, the proof that even 1,000 years ago, the world was woven together by the movement of restless, ambitious, courageous people. And it reminds us that history is not made only by emperors and kings, by the great names that fill the chronicles. It is made also by the unnamed thousands, the half-dans, the ordinary guardsmen who made impossible journeys and lived extraordinary lives and left, at most, a worn name in the marble. For every Harald Hardrada who became a king and a legend, there were thousands of forgotten Northmen who served their years, fought their battles, and either died in some foreign field or sailed quietly home to a farm and a family, carrying their memories of the Golden City to the grave. They do not have sagas written about them. We do not know their names, save for a lucky few scratched in stone. But they were there. They lived it. They felt the heat of a Mediterranean sun their ancestors had never known, tasted wine and spices unimaginable in the north, heard the thunder of the hippodrome and the chant beneath the great dome. They were homesick, surely, on the long nights of the watch, and they must have dreamed of cold fjords and the faces they had left behind. And the institution they collectively formed, the Varangian Guard, endured for 400 years on the strength of their individual courage and loyalty, ordinary men bound by an extraordinary oath. When we tell their story, we are also telling the story of countless human beings who reached far beyond the world they were born into and touched something greater than themselves. Prompton. A wide cinematic vista of a vast medieval trade route winding from snowy northern lands in the far distance toward the sunlit golden city of Constantinople, tiny figures of travelers and longships along the rivers and seas between, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene, Index, 19-chapter title. echoes in the marble. Text, ease. We began with an image, a giant from the cold north, standing before the gates of the richest palace on earth, an axe upon his shoulder, guarding an emperor who could trust no one but a stranger. We asked how such a thing came to be, how Vikings from the ends of the known world ended up holding the fate of an empire in their hands. Now we have followed the whole long arc of the answer, and we can return to that gate and see the warrior with new eyes. He stands there because a frightened young emperor named Basil, with a rebel army at his throat, struck a desperate bargain in the year 988, trading his own sister and the soul of a nation for 6,000 axes. He stands there because the river road from the Varangians to the Greeks carried generations of restless, exiled, ambitious Northmen down to the great city in search of gold and glory. He stands there because his foreignness, the very thing that made him an outsider, made him the one man the emperor could truly trust. He carries that axe because the Byzantines called his kind the Pelakiphoroi, the axe-bearers, and feared them as the most terrible shock troops in the world. He guards not the man, but the office, loyal to the throne itself, ready to serve whoever rightfully holds it. He may grow rich enough to buy a kingdom, as Harald Hardrada did, and ride home to a crown and a saga and a death on a bridge in England that would help reshape the destiny of nations. Or he may simply serve his years and carve his name in the marble of Hagia Sophia like Halfdan, and vanish into the silence of history, leaving only those worn runes behind. Every question the story raised has found its answer in the long telling. And what remains, when the battles are over, and the empire is dust, and the last axe has been laid down, is something quieter and more enduring. It is the marble, with the runes still in it. It is the memory of a connection between worlds, a bridge of human beings spanning the distance between the frozen north and the golden south. It is the proof that loyalty can be found in the most unexpected places, that the stranger can become the truest of guardians, and that ordinary men, far from home, can stand at the very center of history and leave their mark upon the stone. The Varangian Guard lasted 400 years, and then faded into the twilight, but they were never truly lost. They live on in the sagas of the North and the chronicles of the East, in the silver buried in Scandinavian fields, in the worn lion of the harbor, and above all, in those few angular letters scratched into the marble of the most beautiful church in the world. Prompt in. The towering blonde Varangian warrior from the opening, standing once more before the great bronze palace gates at golden dawn, with his axe on his shoulder, but now seen from a reverent low angle, light blazing across the marble, documentary-style hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame. Scene index, 20, text ease. So the next time you read of the Vikings, do not think only of the raiders on the cold northern seas, the burners of monasteries, and the terror of coastal villages. Remember also the other Vikings, the ones who traveled not west into legend, but east and south into history, down the great rivers to the gates of the most magnificent city on earth. Remember the men who traded the axe of the raider for the axe of the guardsman, who stood through the long nights outside the chambers of emperors, who fought and bled and died for a throne that was not their own, in a city whose language they barely spoke and whose faith they came to share. Remember Basil the Bulgar slayer, the frightened young emperor whose desperate gamble created the Guard, and the bargain of 988 that bound the north to the south in blood and gold and faith, and helped bring an entire civilization into the Christian fold. Remember Harald Hardrada, the exile who became a guardsman who became a king, whose hunger carried him from a lost battle in Norway to the heart of Byzantium, and at last to his death on an English bridge, taking the Viking Age down with him. Remember the Anglo-Saxon exiles who fled the Norman conquest and found a strange new home among the descendants of the very people who had once harried their shores. Remember the lonely watches kept through the long nights outside the imperial bedchamber. The foreign tongues whispered in the marble corridors, the runes scratched into the holiest stone in Christendom by men who would have laughed to learn how long their idle marks would last. And remember Halfdan, whoever he truly was, the lonely guardsman who reached out one endless ceremonial day and carved his name into the marble of Hagia Sophia, never dreaming that his idle act of immortality would outlast the empire, the faith, and the civilization that he served. The Varangian Guard reminds us that history is vaster and stranger and more connected than we ever imagine, that the boundaries we draw between peoples and worlds are thinner than they seem, and that even the humblest stranger far from home can stand at the center of everything and leave a mark that lasts 1,000 years. They were the Vikings who guarded the emperors of Byzantium. They sailed to the ends of the known world, and they held an empire in their scarred and frost-bitten hands. And though their watch ended long ago, the marble still remembers them. The story still remembers them. And now, so do you. Prompt in. A sweeping final aerial shot of Constantinople at golden sunset, the great cathedral dome and palace and walls glowing. A tiny silhouette of a lone Varangian Guard standing watch on a high rampart against the radiant sky, documentary-style, hyper-realistic 8K, cinematic lighting, dramatic atmosphere, no modern elements, no text, no letters, no frame.